Hello, classmates. Today I'm going to be talking about politics and political diversity and how that affects education. The first time I recorded this, it was 27 minutes long, so I'm going to try to speak quickly to get through this in the 10-minute time limit. First, I wanted to talk about what politics is. Politics are the activities associated with the governance of a country or other area, especially the debate or conflict among individuals or parties having or hoping to have power. I thought that was a really good definition of politics from just the dictionary. And then I went to the Republican and Democrat kind of platform sites to look at what they believe about education. So, in general, and again, this is a generalization, Republicans tend to believe in limiting federal government control of education. Um, and they really would like educational standards to be developed at the state or local level, and they would like schools to be governed at the state or local level also. Republicans believe in increasing the number of charter schools and offering school tuition vouchers so that parents can have more choice. They believe in merit pay for teachers based on standardized testing. In general, they want to limit the power of teachers' unions. And a famous kind of Republican act is the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 that was passed by President Bush. That kind of was the start of like the Common Core standards and making sure that each state has standards in content areas that they are following. Of course, that's a very controversial act. I believe it's now been succeeded by the Every Child Succeeds Act passed by President Obama. In general, Democrats believe that the role of the federal government in education should be expanded, as well as oversight by the federal government. They believe in government-funded preschool for everyone, so they would like kids to get into school earlier, especially kids that are living in poverty. They are, in general, in favor of strengthening teacher unions and raising salaries for educators, but not necessarily based on merit. And they tend to be against school vouchers because it diverts federal money away from public schools and into private schools. But they are in favor of charter and magnet schools. Also, Democrats tend to focus more on equitable education rather than equal education. So they want to pour funding into programs like after school programs in areas where there's high poverty so that kids don't necessarily have an equal education, but they have more of an equitable education that takes into account poverty and other social issues that kids face in school. Culture has a huge impact on how schools are funded and viewed. Both Democrats and Republicans seem to agree that American education is in trouble, but they have very different ideas about how those issues could be fixed. And in fact, the general public, Democrats and Republicans, do seem to believe that public schools are failing. Most parents give public schools a C or a D. And in fact, the GPA for public schools, as far as an average, is a C or a C minus. So there seems to be some truth to that. It is still unclear whether the failing school narrative is true or whether it's kind of a remnant of the Cold War attitude. During the Cold War, American educational policymakers had a general freak out and were very afraid that the Soviets were going to beat us into space, and they were, developing all these nuclear weapons. And so there was a huge push to increase American academics and to compete with the Soviets. In fact, the AP program was born out of that sort of need to get American schools to be more rigorous. So anyway, it's unclear, like I said, from all the articles I read, whether public education truly is failing or whether this is just kind of, something that has been talked about for a long time. But in general, in red states, this is how people want to, this is the way that people want education to go. So they want the schools to follow more of a free market system. They want to reduce federal spending on education and reduce federal control of education. So they want the state or the local government to have authority over education. And some red states are more pro-school prayer and anti-evolution. So in some of these red states, I mean, even until the present day, some of them are still debating whether or not evolution should be taught in school, things like that. And that's just, culturally, that's just where those people are at. In blue states, traditionally, people believe that education can be improved by expanding federal control and oversight. So the exact opposite of what Republicans believe. They believe in increasing federal funding, also the exact opposite of what Republicans would want. And they believe in providing free preschool for all Americans, which again would expand their power and oversight. So it can be a very partisan topic. In general, liberals and conservatives want exact opposite things where education is concerned. Societally, there are so many things that we could talk about, but I've just chosen 4 for the sake of time and just what I think is most relevant to education. As far as where teachers fall, it turns out that high school teachers are 83% Democrat and 13% Republican. Interestingly, that 13% goes up a little bit when we're talking about math and science teachers, which is what I teach, so I'm always interested in that. But in general, it's thought that, I think that all, like the right wingers all say that, high school students are being brainwashed by liberal teachers. But the reality is, as this quote says, that everything in education, from the textbook to the curriculum and the policies, is politically and ideologically informed. And that's just an inescapable truth. As well as that, both what's taught and how it's taught is shaped by culture, society, and politics, and the historical context in which a school is situated. And we can't pretend that teachers leave those contexts at the door. It's just silly to think that, all of those things would have no role in the classroom. Again, when I look at this one, I think specifically of those southern states where evolution is still being debated. That's a cultural and social and historical situation that those schools are in. And it's, in some ways, while it may seem backward to some of us, it's silly to think that, all of those things would not have an impact on what is taught in school. As far as politics in the classroom go, whether or not students want their teachers to share about what they think politically, in general, the answer is yes. And this is really interesting. I probably won't read all of it for the sake of time, but a very liberal teacher, interviewed one of his very conservative students about what it was like to be in his class. And his answers are really great, and I think would apply whether you have a conservative teacher and a liberal student or vice versa, as in this case. But the student says that the worst part about having a teacher that's kind of the opposite political beliefs as you is that during or before the conversation, they generalize about, in this case, about white men, especially conservative men. I don't think accusing the other group is right, especially when they're being hypocritical about it. I think it's up to teachers to learn and understand this so they can teach their kids. So something that students really object to is this stereotyping and generalizing about huge groups of people. And I think that happens on both sides of the aisle, as we'll see in the next slide. The teacher also asked if it bugs him when teachers are super liberal, and he answers that it really doesn't. He says teachers are rarely openly political, and when they are, there aren't too many problems. So it's not an issue if the teacher is honest about the fact that they are sharing their opinions. He says it's when teachers say that they won't share their opinions and then are passive-aggressive about it. When they're passive-aggressive, it makes you feel judged and like you can't share your opinion. So it looks like things that are most important to students, especially when their teacher is of the opposite political persuasion as them, is that they're honest about the fact that they are sharing their opinion and that they don't generalize about huge groups of people. This is from a teacher perspective, which I thought was interesting. Teachers were talking about how after the election it was challenging for ideological outsiders because the election was so polarizing. So it was really difficult for teachers to know how to talk about their beliefs, especially if they knew that their students, parents, and colleagues would disagree with them. And then down here, one middle school teacher explained that despite the fear many of his students had of deportation, the school tried, by a never-ending desire to remain unbiased, told teachers to limit conversations about the election because that was not included in the standards. Again, going back to that idea of how the classroom is affected by teacher politics, it's kind of silly to believe that even though all these issues are going on in the world, that somehow because it's not in the standards, it's not relevant to education, when that is not in fact the case. Teachers do have a lot of influence, but I've often heard right-wing articles and listened to interviews and things that talk about how liberal teachers are brainwashing children and all of this, but it's actually been found that that's not really the case. Drummond found that there's no evidence from a study of teachers that teachers are actively and purposely trying to indoctrinate children into a particular point of view. He says, we think that this feeling that the public seems to have, that teachers are trying to push their political views on students, is just not really true. When they interviewed students, they found that it was important to them that their teacher make a clear distinction between sharing their view and trying to push their view. And students did not like having teachers' views pushed on them. That is particularly true in high school, which is my age group. Kids are smart, and they know the difference between you sharing your opinion and you trying to get them to kind of come over to your side. And then I wanted to read this one at the top because I think it's so good. It says, what's most important is that teachers create a culture of fairness in the classroom. That means being fair and reasonable to all competing views that are in the classroom and being represented by the public. The practice that we found most troubling from the study is what we refer to the book as political seepage, teachers who make sarcastic comments and use partisan humor. It's these offhanded comments that are sort of biting and mean-spirited about the political climate that I think is problematic, because it creates a climate not of fairness, but an insider-outsider feeling. If you get the humor that I just said, or do you agree with me that this politician's a big idiot, that invites the most divisive parts of the partisan climate into the classroom. So what's most important for teachers to remember is to be fair to everyone, to discuss, not indoctrinate, to be honest about the fact that, instead of being sarcastic and having all this partisan humor and inviting children to, laugh at people who don't share their political views, you should really teach students how to share their ideas respectfully and allow them to engage with their peers and talk about political things that interest them, because kids are really interested in a lot of these political issues. The last thing I want to talk about is civics education, because I think this is something that we can shortchange kids on, and it plays out in the political arena because we are, as a society, we've reached our very lowest voter participation that really has ever been. So this map right here will show you the red states are the only ones that actually require students to do both civics classes and take a civics exam. The light blue ones require students to take a class. The dark blue ones require them just to take an exam. The gray ones don't have any requirements of any kind. And it's kind of easy to see by looking at this map that the majority of states don't really have a good method for educating students about politics or how they can become engaged and active members of their communities in politics, because most Americans, this found only 26% of Americans can even name all three branches of government, which is alarming. Politics does really impact the family and the community. There's two ways that I wanted to look at this. One is how parents influence their children, and the other is the impact of politics on families and students, like the students that might be in your classroom. It's seen that parents do affect their kids' beliefs, and that kids do tend to just follow along their parents' beliefs until they reach a certain age. But it's actually been found through this study that parents who are talk to their kids a lot about politics and are very insistent about politics actually lay the foundation for their children to adopt opposite political views when they get older, because they're more apt to talk about politics, and they're more apt, especially in their older years in high school and college, to talk to others about politics and then be exposed to new viewpoints. So this is an example of two one very left-wing, one very right-wing families. These are the things that they're telling their children. And again, this kind of goes back to that polarizing effect that adults can have on children, where, it's one thing for a parent to do this for their children because that's their child, but it's another thing for a teacher to invite children to make fun of people whose political parties are different than their own. So here's an example. Jennifer and Ryan Rustin of Coral Springs, Florida, are two parents who believe they can train their children to represent how the world should be. They are raising their son Maxwell, age 8, and daughter Anna, 6, to become staunch liberals and atheists. The family refuses to shop at Walmart because its owners are, according to Ryan, goose-stepping Nazis. Clearly, this is a very divisive view, and one that their children will probably abandon as they get older, and as it becomes clear that not everyone that owns Walmart or shops there is a Nazi. That's pretty strong language. Here's one from the opposite side. When Wilder married and started his own family, he set out to ensure that his children were influenced by conservative ideals. He would often discuss the events and issues with them, and explain how the media had reported a slanted view of the issues, then patiently lay out the facts from his point of view. So this is interesting because in my classroom, I've taught kids, especially in the last few years, that just hate Trump. And they cannot explain why. They have just heard their parents talk about it. I've also taught kids that hate Clinton. And again, they cannot explain exactly why, at least not in language that's not, highly emotional. And so as far as rationally, most children are following their parents' beliefs. But once they get to high school and college, that kind of changes. And the last thing I want to talk about is the effect that politics can have on students and families that are part of our public schools. These are the most highly partisan topics between Democrats and Republicans, and I just want to talk about a couple of them. A big one that I want to talk about as a science teacher is climate change and the environment, because this is a really big issue for not only our country but our world. And we are teaching students who are going to go on to make all the decisions for how we're going to care for our planet, and what is to be done about the fact that we're having this, environmental crisis. So I really think it's important for teachers to discuss this in their classrooms and really let kids engage in the issues surrounding climate change and the environment. The other one that I wanted to hit on especially is immigration, because whether or not students feel welcome in their classrooms and in our country, it does impact how they do educationally. When a child is worried that their family is going to be deported, or that they're not welcome, or that they're not really Americans, that is something that can hamper their education and really keep them from realizing their full potential, because they're living in fear. And then last, healthcare costs. Are students receiving the healthcare they need? In areas where there's a lot of poverty, the answer is no. In fact, some schools I researched are actually providing healthcare on site. They're kind of becoming like a one-stop shop for healthcare, dental care. They have food pantries. They have places for kids to buy clothes at a reduced cost. So that's an issue that can really affect students and families, especially those in public schools that are in high poverty areas. So that is my presentation. Here's my resources. If you want to look at any of those, you're welcome to. I hope you learned something new. I learned a lot from this, doing this research project about something I didn't really know anything about. And I look forward to hearing all of your comments in the discussion thread.